Our next panel is actually going to be talking about the weaponization of social media and the spreading of online hate, the in-depth mechanisms and ideologies by which this is happening. Our moderator for this panel is my friend and colleague, Tarek Tayyab. Tarek is a co-founder of the Islam Unraveled Anti-Racism Initiative, as well as Foundation for a Path Forward, which is the official faith-based community convener for the province of British Columbia. He has been working for community empowerment and well-being for over 20 years, and he is a co-founder and director of the Muslim Food Bank and Community Services, as well as a vice president with the BC Muslim Association. Thank you very much. Tarek, it's all yours.
Thank you, Yusuf. I see some friends that have also joined, Constable Shiraz Hadif from the Metro Vancouver Transit Police and Anthony Statham from the RCMP Hate Crimes. And I just wanted to quickly share my journey. So in 2017, the Quebec shootings happened, and the unthinkable, somebody would come into a mosque and shoot people in the back. And that's how I met the hate crimes team, and transit police was when it was a convening of Muslim leaders in British Columbia as to how can we communicate with the Muslim community as to report incidents and biases, however minor they may be. Where there's smoke, there's fire. We need to be able to have the Muslim community feel comfortable to report that. So the idea was, why don't we go to the Friday Jummah prayer, which is the day of the week that Muslims congregate in the largest number, to meet the Muslim community with law enforcement and to get folks to be encouraged to report hate crimes. So naively, with Anthony and Constable Hanif and others, I asked, why is this happening? Why would somebody do that? Why would somebody go into a mosque and shoot people in the back? Where's this stuff coming from? And I think it was Gareth Blount, one of the officers, he said, there's a lot of online hate being spread against racialized minorities like Muslims. I was like, so that's motivating people to do this. So in our work and this particular panel, the weaponization of social media, that social media has turned into a weapon. So the disinformation and lies about Black people, Muslims, Asian people, First Nations, have become so prevalent that it is mobilizing people in a very terrible way to create acts of violence, verbal and physical, and even murder. So this forum, we have two esteemed guests that I consider friends, and I very much respect their work. And I'll introduce our first panelist. Her name is Dr. Heidi Beirich, and she's the co-founder and CEO at the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism. She's the former director of the Intelligence Project, the Southern Poverty Law Center. The Southern Poverty Law Center is the catalyst for racial justice in the South and beyond, working in partnerships with communities to dismantle white supremacy, strengthen intersectional movements, and advance the human rights of all people. And also how white supremacy is now a transnational threat to immigrant and Muslim populations in multiple countries, and what needs to be done to combat it. And the next panelist is also a very good friend, Tony McAleer, who's a former neo-Nazi and founder of Cure for Hate, speaking about white supremacist psychology, ideology, and impact today. He's also the co-founder and formerly of Life After Hate. Life After Hate is committed to helping people leave the violent far right to connect with humanity and lead compassionate lives. Once deeply involved in the white Aryan resistance, Tony McAleer is at the forefront of a group reaching out to turn fascists around from hate. So on that note, I'll start with a question for Tony. And Tony, the psychology, because a lot of times, again, like I naively asked years ago, where is this all coming from? And as you were a leader in our hometown of Vancouver in the white supremacist neo-Nazi sphere, in those days, what was the psychology? What are the prevalent psychologies like generation identity or the great replacement theory that are motivating large groups of people to start to advocate for violence and murder against minorities?
That's a great question, and it's a deep question, and it's, there's a portion of it which is internalized. I think behind the dehumanization of the others is a self-dehumanization that's projected onto others, and I think it's important to recognize that. There's also another level. There's anger and fear. The Great Replacement Theory, all of these theories, all about fear, and it's all about fear of loss, fear of replacement via population, and the anger and fear behind that is based on a misplaced sense of entitlement that mostly white men and women have been nurtured with for a very long time. So to understand where that anger and fear come from, you have to understand the entitlement on which the fear of loss is based. So there's two angles. There's the external portion to it, and then there's the external portion, the projection onto others. And social media. I was around when the internet first came in as a white supremacist organizer, and built one of the very first white supremacist websites for resistance records in 1995. And back then it was the Wild West. It did represent freedom to say whatever you wanted, but the ability to communicate, while it was a huge step forward, really didn't take off until social media came around. And that really multiplied the ability for people to communicate with each other and to form groups, for better or for worse. I mean, there's so many great things that have come out of social media and our ability to connect, and particularly as we've sat in this period of extended isolation. I'd hate to imagine what we would have been like without the internet through this period. But it's allowed for a host of malicious actors to really work with it in a malevolent way. And the challenge with it is it feeds a self-reinforcing hatred of reinforcing pattern of and belief system of hatred and dehumanization. And the way the memes are shared, the way the everything is always trying to outdo the last joke, the last meme, the last act of terror, the last massacre. And it's almost as if that this behavior of hatred, and I want to talk about hatred. I want to distinguish it from people that are misinformed. They have the wrong information in their head and are behaving out of ignorance. Also, people that they're missing critical information, which leads them to behave also out of ignorance. But we're talking about actual violent hatred, and the social media, I think, has allowed, and other medias around social media have allowed for the gamification of this violent hatred. And I think that at some level it becomes addictive. I think people become addicted to being angry. I think people become addicted to being hateful, and they become addicted to the attention they get when they say angry and hateful things. And I think it's that gamification of hatred, which is particularly virulent and particularly of concern, because it does lead people down a rabbit hole. A question I've been asked a long time ago is, how did I lose my humanity? You seem like a nice guy. How did I lose my humanity? And I said, I didn't lose it. I traded it for acceptance and approval until there was nothing left. And nobody starts off shooting people in the back in a mosque. It's an incremental slide down a hole until they become completely out of touch with. At that point, a lot of that is out of touch with reality, out of touch with their own humanity, and out of touch with the humanity of others in the process. And so I think we need to really worry about the gamification of this violent hatred.
And you brought up a great point, and with social media, and specifically social media platforms like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and Instagram, and these are the modern tools of communication, and the virtual world is now the real world in terms of communication, education, bias, and beliefs. Even beliefs, people's beliefs are being shaped by what they see online. And in the very rich research that the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism puts out, and I've read the reports that Heidi, your team, has put together, very powerful. But if you could talk about the role of these platforms and how these platforms are being used by these groups to recruit, to spread this disinformation and violent rhetoric and incitement to violence. And I think, again, a lot of meetings we have, a lot of people don't understand how pervasive, how prevalent, and how dangerous online hate is. Please add to the conversation about social media and its role as a weapon.
Okay, thanks, Tarek, and also thanks to all the organizers here. I think Tony did a good job of explaining one of the ways that social media has weaponized this gamification. I think is right, especially with young people. That is a particularly pernicious way to walk someone down the path of radicalization, and something that just didn't exist, 20 years ago. I think the dark side of social media has done some terrible things to all of us. It has normalized hatred against various groups, Muslims, Jews, others, by making it appear when you're on Facebook or you're on Twitter as though these noxious ideas are normal because you're surrounded by hundreds of other people who are sharing those ideas. And if you were in a park in downtown Vancouver, you wouldn't be seeing that kind of warped view of the world. So that's one problem that we have. We've also seen the social media companies' systems, their algorithms, their ad systems, and so on, amplify hate content because they tend to spread polarizing content, which gets them clicks, gets people to view posts in a way that they don't push non-polarizing content. In other words, it's to their advantage, and this has been exposed repeatedly, to push the most angry, divisive material you can get. And then we have the issue that in the social media space, politicians who are willing to push extreme ideas, I'm thinking here of our former president in the United States and his attacks on immigrants and Muslims in particular, were given loopholes. In other words, the community standards that apply to all the rest of us didn't apply to exactly the people, political figures with large audiences, who have the ability to mobilize people into hate, which is a particularly egregious situation. And this isn't just something that's happening in the United States or in Canada. These problems are now being found worldwide. There are extremist political movements like Prime Minister Modi in India, who has risen to power along with his allies by demonizing the Muslim community. In Brazil, President Bolsonaro and his allies have been demonizing the LGBTQ community. In Germany, there's a party that runs entirely on anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant beliefs. All of these political figures with their large audiences are demonizing groups of people, communities of color predominantly, and using it to build a base and to teach supporters and potential supporters that it's completely normative and okay to say hateful things on a regular basis. So, Tony's right to think about the internet, or I think Mohammed talked about it a little earlier, as a zone of freedom. And it's impossible to imagine what our lives would have been like in the last year and a half without it. But at the same time, there has been a huge downside hitting largely marginalized and vulnerable communities in terms of violent hatred and even up to genocide. And we should remember this. The Rohingya genocide in Myanmar was orchestrated by military leaders of that state by using Facebook to demonize Muslims and to actually tell people who to attack and how to attack. And that's not the only place we've seen these things. So there's substantial real world violence coming off these platforms. And this is why something has to be done to rein the tech companies in, so that the good parts of the internet are allowed to flourish and the bad parts are stopped.
And in terms of solutions, Tony and Heidi, both of you have worked with the New Zealand government, and in the aftermath of the Christchurch shootings, where 51 people were killed in 2 mosques by somebody who was radicalized online. And as you mentioned, and I just wanted to illustrate one point, that lone actors, they're not lone actors if their community is online. So if it seems like one person was the shooter, but they have thousands of people that have been egging them on, that they've had online relationships and camaraderie, as Tony mentioned, when he was in this sphere, providing the community. So those virtual communities are influencing this. It's not lone individual actors. But just to go back to solutions and the Christchurch call, perhaps Tony, you could start about the Christchurch call, and then Heidi, you can add to it. Please go ahead, Tony.
The Christchurch call happened, I think it was in May of 2019, in the aftermath of what happened and the terrorist attack upon the 2 mosques in New Zealand, in a way to bring the Prime Minister of New Zealand government brought people together in Paris, about 40 people.
I usually have 2 cards, but
myself included, to discuss how do we tackle this, because there's no easy solution. There's no switch that we can hit to make it all go away. It's a very complex problem, and I believe it's going to take a whole of society solution to tackle this, and part of that solution is technological. There's no question. And as Vidya had said earlier, there's some platforms that, like 8chan, or some platforms are, you think they're a big platform that's 2 guys in Poland, it's their side hustle. There's no way that they're going to mediate those. So we have to have a look at a technological solution. We also have to understand that technology is in itself part of the solution, and that technology can be harnessed and social media can be harnessed to combat these ideas, to counter message, to provide a variety of responses. But there needs to be a responsible look at the platforms, and the platforms need to coordinate with each other. And some of that is already happening. I've spent time down at Facebook and with GIFCT and Tech Against Terror, and there's a whole lot of great technological minds looking to tackle this, but it's a lot more complex and a lot more difficult than it seems. But the Christchurch call, at least at the beginning, is about bringing together a unified solution so that this doesn't happen again in the future. And I'll let Heidi add her 2 cents, because she's very much involved with it as well.
Well, the solutions, first of all, I want to say Tony's right. This is a whole of society issue, right? So we're not just talking about what to do about the social media platforms or technology. And, Vidya mentioned some important things having to do with, literacy and fighting conspiracies. I mean, there's a lot of other things, education, that matter here to make people less susceptible to what's found online. But, at this point, most of the social media companies have decent or serviceable terms of service. The problem is that they're not applying them systematically and in the way that they're laid out. I just want to say YouTube, which is the platform that radicalized the Christchurch mosque shooter, is egregious in not following its rules. So there has to be a way to hold these companies to account. And what's interesting is that where that pressure is probably going to come from is from the European Union, that's looking at tighter regulations on this front, or from the United Kingdom, where there's an online harms bill being debated. It's most likely not going to happen in the United States because of the way the First Amendment works here. In fact, most of the changes in social media companies have come because of pressure of civil society in the United States and other places, not because of regulatory frameworks. So regulation is very, very important. Forcing the companies to apply their rules to all people matters deeply and would have a big suppressive effect on extremist movements like Modi's movement in India. That matters. On top of that, depending on which country you're talking about, there are hate speech efforts, bills. This is never going to happen in the United States because of the First Amendment, that will also have a suppressive effect. And if you have an effective law enforcement apparatus that will enforce hate speech penalties against material online, that can make a difference as well. Now, all of that said, we aren't going to ever be able to do anything about places like Telegram or 8kun. But by getting this stuff off of social media as much as possible and having them also make their artificial intelligence accountable for not spreading hate speech and bad ideas, we're going to cut off the sort of the biggest recruitment platforms, right? The places where most people are. Most people aren't on 4chan, 8kun, and whatnot. There's a lot of people there, but not the kind of widespread recruitment opportunities you have on the mainstream social media, channels. So this is all about trying to deal with the companies supplying this hateful material. We still have issues of dealing with individual demand that's not just driven on getting sucked down rabbit holes or radicalized online. But those are all things that are going to be needed, tools that are going to be needed to be thrown at this really serious problem.
And at the moment, self-regulation, as you said, the social media companies are not following their own terms and conditions and their safety regulations. They're not following it in a systematic way. So in terms of Canada, the federal government and provincial governments regulating the online hate space, any recommendations based on what you would recommend for policymakers, government officials to consider? What are the lines between online hate, freedom of expression, which is the term in Canada rather than freedom of speech, and incitement to violence? So there's a lot of gray areas there. So maybe Tony or Heidi, whoever would like to start first, about what would recommendations be and how could it look like?
I'll just start with saying I think it's really important that we define it properly. I think because hate is, as one of the speakers earlier alluded to, we've almost become desensitized to it. And what does it actually mean? Is it someone who disagrees with us? Is that a hateful comment because I don't like it? I think we need to be very clear in our definitions if we're going to regulate it properly from a legislative perspective. I think the Supreme Court in Canada has allowed for restrictions to freedom of expression, and I can't remember the legislation, but so the mechanisms are there if we do it properly. But I think it's one of the key things is that we need to define exactly what it is. I think the definitions are hugely important.
Yeah, I agree with Tony. I mean, you can't get at this problem without defining these things, and they are actually quite vague in many cases. There's the interesting situation in New Zealand right now where they're in the midst of accepting comments about possible strengthening to their hate speech law. And there's a lot of definitional debates about what applies and what doesn't. And so that's a key thing. I mean, my suggestion to the Canadian government would be to take a hard look at the German law, the British planned law, and the EU framework and try to figure out what pieces of that have been most successful and would be useful within the Canadian space. But I would also say, and I would say this to the US government as well, we need more data out of the companies. There's a lot that we don't know about what they're doing. how does your algorithm either increase polarization or reduce polarization? How much hate content you actually have online? What percentage do you really take down? Right now, we just have self-reporting from these companies. And what we really need is people who have the power of subpoena, at least in the American sense, I'm not sure what it is in Canada, to be able to really document what is happening inside these black boxes so that we can make policy decisions that make sense.
Absolutely. And now, as we are closing our panel, and we could keep talking because Heidi, you're an expert, Tony, you are an expert, and there's many aspects and nuance to this discussion. But in closing remarks in this panel, I'll start with Tony and then with Heidi as takeaways for the audience and the people that will be viewing this after this forum is over. So final takeaways, Tony.
Final takeaways, I think that there's something else that people should, I think, consider, because I think looking at this as a whole of society response, I think we should each look into our hearts and where are we judgmental? It may not be about race, it may not be about something, but we can't be okay with dehumanization and judging people on one side and then over here not like it. I think we have to look at society as a whole and how do we get away from the increasing polarization and judgment of the other side that happens politically as well. Because if we get rid of all of the based on race, religion, and that type of thing, but we are a gaping wound of polarization on the political side, I don't know that we'll be in any better place.
Thank you.
I don't know if I can say much better than what Tony does. He always does it from such a much more heartfelt and less clinical position than where I am all the time. That, of course, thank you, Tony. That, of course, would be best. I mean, the other thing I would ask the audience here is to listen to the clips that I'm sure you all put up of the earlier speakers. I think sometimes we don't realize how much pain there is when you're subjected to these things. And we need to put ourselves in the shoes of other communities and people with different experiences. And I think when you do that, it builds that empathy and makes you come to see the world from a better place. So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you, Heidi. And for those that aren't aware, the Global Project Against Hate and Extremism, a lot of very detailed research reports that I'd recommend everyone to read, and we will share those reports with those that request it. Then Tony, The Cure for Hate, to connect with Tony, and Tony does a lot of great work as well. So both of them, anyone who wants to connect with them, please let us know. Yusuf, please.